All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive into the life of Thomas Wayne Crump. And I got to say, this is a story. It's a story that goes through like decades of escalating crime. It's one of those that is both fascinating and kind of deeply unsettling. Crump's life, it seems like it was marked by violence from a very young age, really ultimately culminating in these horrific acts that spanned multiple states.
Yeah, what I think is so striking about Crump's case
Yeah.
is how, his story isn't just like a sudden plunge into darkness, right? It's more of a gradual descent. And we can actually trace this all the way back to his teenage years when he was already getting involved in car thefts. And now, for many, that might just seem like typical teenage rebellion. But for Crump, it really marked the beginning of a pattern that would only escalate over time.
But we're not talking about like
Oh,
a kid who just, took the family car for a joyride.
Yeah.
No, not at all. This was much more organized, much more deliberate. He was part of a group. And they weren't just out for thrills. These were calculated acts. And I think it's important to understand that this early behavior, as troubling as it was really just the tip of the iceberg.
Okay, so the car thefts, these were a sign of something more serious to come. What happened next?
Well, by the time he was 18, so in 1958, Crump was already facing an attempted murder charge. He actually tried to kill a woman who was connected to a dispute with his mother. And it was a chilling act of violence, especially for someone so young. But what's, I think, particularly concerning is that, this early encounter with the justice system, it didn't seem to deter him, It didn't really serve as a wake-up call.
So he kind of got off easy.
He did. He received a suspended sentence and managed to avoid, any serious consequences. And sadly, this pattern of evading real punishment, it would repeat itself throughout his early criminal career. He seemed to kind of slip through the cracks time and again, almost as if the system itself was enabling his escalating behavior.
That's terrifying. I mean, it's almost like every time he got away with something, it fueled his next, even more serious offense. So the attempted murder didn't stop him? What did he do next?
Well, his crimes just continued to escalate. He moved from car theft to robbery, even kidnapping. And then in 1967, while he was in Michigan, he committed another attempted murder, this time stabbing a waitress 10 times after she asked for his ID.
Wow, 10 times. It sounds like a fit of rage almost, like impulsive.
Exactly. There's a clear pattern here of escalating aggression and a tendency toward these impulsive, violent outbursts. This time, though, he couldn't escape the consequences. He was sentenced to prison, which, you would think would have forced him to confront his actions and maybe even, deter future violence.
You would hope so. But I have a feeling that's not quite what happened.
You're right. Prison didn't rehabilitate Thomas Wayne Crump. In fact, it's possible that it had the opposite effect, maybe even hardening him, making him even more detached from the consequences of his actions. And we'll kind of delve into that a bit more later. But for now, let's fast forward to 1976. So Crump is released from prison, and he returns to Albuquerque, seemingly, determined to start this new life.
So he's trying to go straight, gets a job, maybe settles down.
He does. He starts working in construction, and he eventually lands a managerial position at, of all places, KFC. He even gets married to a much younger woman named Rhonda Higdon, who was one of his employees. It might seem like he was finally turning things around.
Yeah, but it sounds like there's a but coming.
There is. The marriage quickly deteriorates, and Rhonda files for divorce. And it's on July 13th, 1980, the very same day that Rhonda files those papers, that things take a truly horrific turn.
This is where his crimes turn deadly.
Yes. Crump convinces Rhonda to meet him by the Rio Grande, under the pretense of, sharing one last meal together. But instead of reconciliation, he shoots her 5 times and hides her body. It's a calculated, cold-blooded act that really marks this terrifying escalation in his violence.
From attempted murder to outright murder. And this is just the beginning of this horrifying 5-month spree.
That's right. Over the next 5 months, Crump embarks on this rampage of violence. Across New Mexico and Nevada, he goes on to attack a man who had given him a ride, slashing his throat, robbing him, and leaving him for dead. Thankfully, the man survived, but Crump continues on his spree, eventually reaching Las Vegas, where he murders Jody Jamison, a prostitute, drowning her in a motel bathtub.
So it seems like his violence is really spiraling out of control at this point. Each act is more brutal than the last. And he doesn't seem to care who he hurts or what the consequences might be.
You're picking up on a key element here. There's a distinct lack of remorse, a chilling indifference to the suffering that he's inflicting. And this pattern only seems to intensify as his spree continues.
So what happens next? I mean, he's committed multiple murders at this point, across state lines. How does this end?
Well, his spree doesn't actually end in Vegas. He ends up returning to Albuquerque and tragically takes another life. This time, the victim is 78-year-old Irving Plaisted, who was simply offering Crump directions when Crump robbed him and shot him, first in the chest, then in the head.
This poor man is just senseless, a complete disregard for human life.
Yeah, and these actually weren't his only crimes during this period. He also shot his 2 roommates, thankfully they survived, and robbed a flower shop. It's a whirlwind of violence, fueled by what seems like, pure rage and a complete lack of empathy.
So how does this reign of terror finally come to an end?
Well, eventually, like with most criminals who go on sprees like this, he gets sloppy, and he's arrested in November 1980. And, facing this overwhelming evidence, Crump confesses to his crimes, including the murders.
Confesses, just like that.
Yeah, it seems like the weight of his actions, the sheer volume of his crimes, it finally caught up to him. And he's ultimately sentenced to life in prison for the murders of Rhonda Higdon and Irving Plaisted. But even behind bars, Crump's capacity for violence, his need for control, it doesn't diminish. In fact, it seems to intensify.
And this is where the story gets even crazier, right? He escapes from prison?
He does. In 1981, he participates in a prison riot that results in the death of a guard. And then, in a truly audacious move, he escapes from the penitentiary of New Mexico.
Okay, you have to tell me how he escaped from prison.
It's this story that almost defies belief. Picture this. He's in the prison kitchen, shackled, baking a pumpkin pie, and he manages to slip out of his restraints and somehow escapes the prison. It's a brazen act, almost unbelievable and incredibly dangerous. He's a man with nothing to lose at this point, a man who's already killed, and clearly has no qualms about doing so again. And he does go right back to his old ways.
Right back to his old ways?
He immediately returns to Albuquerque and embarks on this terrifying carjacking spree, specifically targeting cab drivers.
Cab drivers. Was that just random, or was there something more to it?
It's a good question. It's possible that he saw them as, easy targets, vulnerable, or maybe, there's a deeper psychological motivation at play, a desire to exert power and control over others. Whatever the reason, it's clear that he was driven by a very dark impulse, a need to inflict pain and fear.
And there was that chilling detail about him, like introducing himself to one of the victims before shooting him.
Yeah, that was Steve Hewitt. So Crump carjacked him, and before shooting him, not once but twice in the head, he actually said, "I want you to know I'm Thomas Wayne Crump."
Wow.
It's a bone-chilling detail, and it really speaks to a level of arrogance, a need for recognition that is just truly disturbing. It's like he wanted his victims to know who was responsible for their suffering.
Thankfully, Hewitt survived, but sadly, that wasn't the case for his next victim.
No. His next victim, another cab driver named Ian Smith, wasn't so lucky. During a struggle, Crump accidentally shoots himself in the shoulder, but still manages to fatally wound Smith.
So he accidentally shoots himself, ends up injured and in pain. Is that how they finally caught him?
Yes. Wounded and desperate, Crump stumbles into a nearby motel. He's found there, crying in pain, and arrested. It's almost an anticlimactic end to his violent spree. This hardened criminal, reduced to this, whimpering, wounded figure. But it's important to remember that, this moment of vulnerability doesn't erase the horrors he inflicted.
You said he was extradited to Nevada to stand trial for the murder of Jody Jamison. What happened at that trial?
Well, the trial itself was fairly straightforward. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but there was one particularly disturbing aspect of the trial, something that really sheds light on the depths of Crump's depravity. The jury was presented with a recording of Crump's confession. And in this recording, he admits to killing Jody Jamison. But what's truly chilling is his complete lack of remorse. He claims that she deserved what she got because she was supposedly involved with a criminal.
So he was trying to justify his actions?
It seems so. But even if that were true, it doesn't explain the brutality of the act, the coldness with which he describes taking her life. In the recording, he even says, and I quote, "I could have obtained my money without killing her. I just wanted to kill her."
Wow.
This statement, I think it offers a glimpse into the mind of a man, driven by this profound darkness, a complete disregard for human life.
It's terrifying to think that someone could be so casually cruel, so devoid of empathy.
It is, and it raises so many questions about, the nature of evil, the origins of such profound darkness. Is it something someone is born with, or is it a result of their experiences, their environment? These are questions we may never be able to answer definitively.
So what happened to Crump after this trial? He's confessed to the murder, showed no remorse. What was the outcome?
Well, he was convicted. and sentenced to death for the murder of Jody Jameson. He would spend the next 34 years on death row. His execution was delayed multiple times. And even in this final chapter of his life, his capacity for violence remained.
He continued to be violent.
Yeah.
Even on death row.
Yes. In 1992, he stabbed a fellow death row inmate, and he also, he made claims of having killed a total of 7 people, including a priest when he was only 16 years old, however. These confessions remain unconfirmed. It's possible they were fabrications, an attempt to, further solidify his image as this hardened criminal, or perhaps they were true, a testament to a lifetime of violence that began at a shockingly young age.
So we're left with more questions than answers.
In a way, yes. But I think the most important takeaway from Crump's story isn't about, the exact number of his victims or the precise motivations behind his actions. It's about recognizing the patterns of escalating violence, the red flags that were present throughout his life, and the missed opportunities for intervention.
Yeah. We saw those missed opportunities time and again, right? The suspended sentences, the lack of serious consequences for his early crimes. It really makes you wonder if things could have been different.
Exactly. And it's not just about punishment, right? It's about addressing the underlying issues, whether it's mental health, substance abuse, or exposure to violence. We need to offer support, resources, and opportunities for rehabilitation. Yeah, it's about recognizing that people can change, that even someone who has committed, truly terrible acts can still be reached.
Right. Not about excusing what they did, but just acknowledging that human behavior is complex and that there's always a possibility for redemption. It's a difficult concept, especially when we're dealing with, crimes as horrific as Crump's. But I do think it's an important one to keep in mind.
Absolutely.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what's the most important thing you want our listener to take away from Crump's story?
I think the most crucial message here is that we all have a role to play in preventing violence. It's not just the responsibility of law enforcement or the justice system. It's about being aware, being vigilant, and being willing to, speak up if we see something concerning.
It's about recognizing that violence is never the answer and that there are always other options, right? Other paths we can choose.
Exactly. And if you're interested in learning more about this topic, I encourage you to, explore resources on criminal psychology, the impact of trauma, and the restorative justice movement. There's a wealth of information out there, and it's up to each of us to seek it out and apply it to our lives.
Thomas Wayne Crump's story. It is a dark and disturbing one, but it's also one that I think can teach us some valuable lessons. By understanding those factors that contribute to violence, by recognizing the warning signs, and seeking help when needed, we can hopefully create a safer and a more compassionate world for ourselves and for future generations. That's all for today's deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.